Morning. Well, it's so good to be back with you all again today. For those who don't know me, like Ben said, I lead an organization called Claris Health, and Claris means clarity. We primarily work with pregnant women and families, offering medical, mental health, and support services in clinics in South LA and West LA, and a mobile clinic that drives into some of the most underserved neighborhoods in our city. See, in a world that so often tries to polarize topics around women's health and pit people against each other, we stand in the gap, letting them know that there is always more than one option, and more importantly, that their lives have incredible value and that they're not alone through these situations. And this church has joined us on this mission for many years, and we are so grateful for your partnership. I can tell you it is making a huge difference in the city. When Ben asked me to speak a couple months ago, he didn't give me a lot of instruction, and so I thought, I'm going to get up, I'm going to give you guys an update, I'm going to tell you great stories, and I'll connect them to the gospel. And then a few weeks ago, he said, we're in Exodus, and it would be really great if you could continue with chapter 16, and I had two thoughts. First was, does this guy think that I'm a real preacher? And the second was, how do I Exodus out of this situation? So, as I sat and I read through this chapter, though, I realized that this is exactly what I should be focusing on in my life. See, my life has been pretty rocked in the last few years. Personally, I have watched a loved one be completely destroyed by addiction, and I am now living a life that I never imagined. And there are some days that honestly I've wondered if there is still a hopeful future for myself and for my children. And professionally, I celebrated 23 years as the CEO of Claris, but it is, yes, amazing accomplishment, but yes, thank you. There's a but. But it has also been one of the hardest seasons that I've ever been in. And there are so many promised land type dreams on the horizon, but on a day-to-day basis, I have never carried as big of a burden with so few people to my left and my right. And confession, I am a professional grumbler, especially if it involves any form of injustice, and I am now raising two grumbler children. So as I read Exodus 16, I can see myself, and I'm so convicted in every single part of the story. But God has so lovingly used this passage in the last week or so to remind me of his faithfulness through our trials. So I stand here today not as a preacher, but just as somebody who with you is seeking to know God better. I was listening to a podcast this week, and there was a man named Davey Blackburn, and he was sharing that after his pregnant wife was murdered, he said, I never questioned God's existence, I questioned his kindness. And perhaps you can relate to that. You know that God exists, you know that he's real, but because of whatever you're facing today or whatever you've faced in the past, you wonder if he's kind or if he cares deeply for you. See, Exodus 16 to me is just this beautiful expression and reminder of God's kindness. So let's dive in together. So at this point in the story, we know the Israelites have left Egypt after they witnessed this dramatic escape plan where God literally parted the sea and swallowed up their enemies. And now they're in Sin Desert. He said it's a hostile environment of sand and stone. Made me think of Palm Springs minus all the fancy resorts. And they are slowly making their way to Canaan, the promised land. At this point, they're about 1 month into what we know ends up being a 40-year journey. So chapter 16 starts with the Israelites complaining again, and this time they're complaining about not having enough food. So as these people were met with a dangerous environment and food scarcity, they complained bitterly against Moses and Aaron, the men that God called to lead them. Exodus 12 says that they estimate there are about 600,000 men. So scholars assume that with women and children, there could be as many as 2 million people. Can you imagine the complaints of 2 million people? In verse 3, they're so upset that they say, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and we ate all the food we wanted, but you, Moses, have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. See, in that moment of stress and of desperation, they lose sight of the God who delivered them. They're mad at him, saying it would have been better if you had just killed us when we were in Egypt. they're also doubting Moses' leadership, accusing him of bringing them into this desert to die. These Israelites are so fixated on the past that even though at this point they're physically free, they're emotionally and spiritually still in bondage. Several years ago, I took my kids to Disneyland. I'd been planning and saving for this trip for a really long time. And 1 hour in, we hit traffic, major LA traffic, and the complaining started. When are we going to get there? I'm bored. I'm hungry. I have to pee. This is too far. And then my youngest, this little cutie, has the nerve to say it to me. She says, I didn't even want to go here. She says, you're the one making me do this. And I had this thought, I worked so hard to take you to the happiest place on earth, and you were sitting here mad at me? And I was thinking of this passage this week. I thought, oh my gosh, I bet that's how Moses felt in that moment. He knew these people have this promised land ahead of them, but they're so hungry and distracted that they lose focus. So how do we respond when we're hungry, tired, desperate, or uncomfortable? What do we do when we're faced with uncertainty? When our current circumstances don't reflect this desired future? See, fear can lead us to turn or return to slavery, to long for that quick fix, that addiction, that unhealthy relationship, that bad attitude, or the false idols that we've created in our life. See, uncomfortable situations, whether they are of our own doing or whether they are completely out of our control, they demand a response from us. This photo is of my daughter, Addie, and my friend Dave. Dave and I have known each other for 25 years. And this photo was taken on June 1st of this year. Dave turned 50 that day, and my daughter Addie turned 12. And just 6 months earlier, Dave was diagnosed with ALS, and he passed away 8 days after this photo was taken. But this past January, when Dave received that ALS diagnosis, he knew that he was heading down a road that was surely marked with suffering and a very uncertain earthly future. And this was part of his ALS announcement. He said, this was pretty much the top 5 worst things to get diagnosed with. Since that day, there have been many tears, deep breaths, telling our kids, telling our family, friends. In the midst of all of it, there's an inexplicable peace that comes from a deep faith in a good God. I can't explain it. I'm convinced that he has a purpose in something that is so challenging. He said, I want him to heal me, but I also want to see God honored and to live this horrible diagnosis out well. Well, that is exactly what Dave did for the next 6 months. Or 5 months, he started to lose basic functions, and there were undoubtedly moments of fear. But Dave made a choice. Instead of looking backwards or being upset how unfair that diagnosis was, he spent each day loving his wife and his kids. He was purposeful in pursuing relationships with family and friends. He made all these silly videos on Instagram so that we would never forget him, and he drew everyone around him to Jesus. See, Dave was physically enslaved to this horrific disease of this world, but emotionally and spiritually, Dave was free. My grandfather was born in 1930 in Mississippi. His parents died when he was really young, and he experienced poverty, segregation, racism, and many challenges throughout his life, but you would never know it. See, my grandfather met Jesus in his 40s, and he was radically changed. His circumstances never changed, but he did. He went from being a man that struggled with anger and addiction and the sins of the world to the most joy-filled, gentle person I've ever met in my life. He would literally sing praises and hymns all day and meditated on God's word day and night. I can hear him singing right now, on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. See, he used to tell me, if you focus on our differences in this world, you will be angry, and it will just create an even bigger divide. If you focus on the bad that is done to you, you will miss all the blessings around you. But if you focus on Jesus, then all this earthly yuck begins to fade away. So he refused to allow this world to enslave him. See, Dave and my grandpa aren't examples of the power of positive thinking or some name it and claim it theology, but rather there is a power in shifting our mindset to an eternal perspective. See, our attitude won't change the outcomes of our situation. Only God does that. But our attitude sure affects our journey along the way. See, in verse 4 of Exodus, God says to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven. The people are to go out and to gather enough for that day. In verse 6 and 7, Moses and Aaron tell the people, they say it to the people this way, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of God, because he has heard your grumbling against him. In verse 8, Moses makes it even more clear. He says, you will know it was the Lord when he gives you meat in the evening and bread in the morning. And then Moses calls the people out. He says, you're not grumbling against us, speaking about Moses and Aaron. He says, you are grumbling against the Lord. Boy, do we need a Moses sometimes in our lives that can remind us that we're grumbling against God. And don't miss the miracle here that God is saying that this mysterious bread that they end up calling manna would appear on the ground in the morning when the dew disappears, and they were supposed to collect it. And then when they look to the sky in the evening, he will rain down quail. See, God's provision would come from above and from below. No matter what the condition of their hearts was or their lack of faith, God heard their cries, and he planned to surround them with his provision. Watch this in verse 10. While Aaron is speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked to the desert, and here was the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. See, God not only speaks through Moses and Aaron, he then goes on and he visually reveals his majesty to the Israelites again, this time in a cloud. And sometimes God speaks to us through others, and sometimes there is visible evidence right in front of our eyes. Maybe it's a health diagnosis that they almost missed, or the job that you didn't expect to get, or the bag of groceries that appear on your doorstep, or the estranged child that returns home, or the accident that almost happened. See, for the Israelites, even as this miracle is happening right in front of their eyes, they seem to forget again. In verse 14 and 15, Moses says, when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost appeared on the desert floor. And when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is this? And Moses said to them, this is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. Are there blessings in your life today that you need to be reminded of? Maybe it's family, or the clothes on your back, or this beautiful, hot California sunshine, or the paycheck in your bank, this sweet church community, or the air that fills your lungs. See, through the Israelites' journey, we see God's heart for humanity revealed. And God desires to meet your and my daily needs. He desires us so much so that he sent his son to this earth to die so that our needs would be met for eternity. John 6:48 says, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. But this is the bread that comes down from heaven, so no one may eat of it. So the one may eat of it and not die. It says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. See, as I look at the story of the Israelites, I ask myself, do I trust God? Do I trust him with my uncertain future? See, God spoke multiple reminders to the people through Moses and Aaron, and God still speaks to us today. 2 years ago, my first time speaking here at Vintage, a group of people prayed over me after the service, and they didn't know that I was facing this huge decision at work. See, we could step out in faith and move toward this dream opportunity to build a campus in South LA. We wanted to bring nonprofits together under one roof to better serve women and families in need. But I was terrified. I have never led a capital campaign. We seemed to always be short-staffed. I wondered would other partners even want to join us in this? And at the end, one of the men prayed. I actually saw him this morning in the lobby, and probably does not remember this, but he turned to me after he prayed and said, "You're facing a really big decision." And I remember just being completely frozen. And he said, "God's asking you to take a bold step." He said, "You're filled with doubt, but he wants you to know that he called you to this. He wants you to be brave." And then he said, "You're not supposed to lead the way others do. This experience, whatever it is that you're set out to do, is going to remind you that your confidence only comes from him. You just have to stand firm." I wrote those words down as soon as I got to my car, and I've kept them as a note in my phone, and I pull them out many times when I'm like, oh gosh, why am I doing this? What do we do? And on June 28th of this year, we purchased a building in South LA, and God continues to remind me of that this is his will. He keeps showing little nuggets of reminders. But at the same time, I will tell you, it has been really, really hard. And there is a long road ahead of us, and there are so many unanswered questions. And if I don't cling to God's promises, I will be filled with doubt. See, sometimes even when you know you're following God's lead, it can still feel like a wilderness experience. And if you are here today and you're wondering, how do I seek God in the midst of this wilderness that seems to surround me? Here are 3 tips that you can consider. The first is to look back and to remember the times that God has delivered you. In verse 32 in Exodus, Moses says, "This is what the Lord commanded. Take an omer, a 2-quart container of manna, and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." See, the wilderness exposes areas where we lack faith. And through testing and trials, just like the Israelites, we have a chance to adopt a new identity, to act like free people whose foundation is firmly rooted in the Lord. After my friend Dave passed away, his wife told me that the song "Firm Foundation" has become her anthem. Hear these words. It says, "I've still got joy in chaos. I've got peace that makes no sense. So I won't be going under. I'm not held by my own strength. Because I've built my life on Jesus. He's never let me down. He's faithful in every season. So why would he fail now?" If your future seems unknown, or if you're struggling to stay content, root your foundation in Jesus and remember the goodness of God. Psalms 145, 8-9 says, "The Lord is gracious and full of compassion. He is slow to anger and of great mercy. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are all over his works." The second point is to worship through the trials. I found this Tim Keller quote this week, and he said, "The secret to enslaving patterns of sin is worship. You need worship. You need great worship. You need weeping worship. You need glorious worship. You need to sense," there's a typo in that, "you need to sense God's greatness and to be moved by it, moved to tears and moved to laughter, moved by who God is and what he has done for you." And this needs to be happening all the time. So if you're hurting today, I encourage you at the end of this service, spend time in worship. Go home, turn it on in your car, cry out to God as you're driving or sitting in traffic on the freeway. See, like my grandpa, we can fill our minds and our hearts with songs of praise. And if God has delivered you, praise him today through worship. Thank him for what he's doing or what he's done in your life. And the third point is to trust him with the process. Join me in watching this video. So several years ago, Some of our donors started calling the office and saying that they had seen a pregnant woman in Malibu that was homeless, and they were worried and wondered if they could somehow connect her to Clarice. And we discovered that she had already come to Clarice as a client and had had a really good experience. And so several donors would check up on her. They were giving her food and just trying to connect her. And I believe one day I got a call from the task force in Malibu. It was a homelessness task force, and they had specifically created a division that was keeping an eye on this young mom because they wanted her to deliver safely. One afternoon, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and I looked down and I had a call or a missed call or a text, and it was from the sheriff in Malibu, and he said that her water broke along PCH, and they were trying to get her in an ambulance, and they were taking her to UCLA. An interesting turn of events, one of our doctors works at UCLA Santa Monica and was able to sort of oversee her case and make sure that she was safe. So it was a really sweet thing knowing that behind the scenes there were all these people that she never even knew, but that knew of her story and really loved and cared about her. So for a good week or two, I mean, every day was working with her. We coordinated meals that were being brought to the hotel, and just every day I could tell was a struggle for her. I went to the hotel to bring her some food and had some things to talk to her about, and she cracked the door open and wouldn't let me in the room for the first time, and behind the door I could see a shopping cart. And she said that she was going back to the streets and that she felt safer there. We had gotten her into a home that she could live, and she just said she couldn't do it and that she was sorry. And she ended up coming out of the room, and we just sat on the curb together. And I remember she wouldn't look me in the eye, but it was one of the most honest conversations I think I've had with somebody, where we talked a lot about just her mental health and just the struggle. And you could see in that moment, it was like a mom that did love her baby, but didn't know that she was okay to raise her. And so there was such this like war inside. So when everything was happening at the hospital and we were trying to help present some families for her to consider for adoption, I had sent a message to pretty much everyone I knew, and I almost immediately heard about this family, Matt and Nicole.
I first learned about Clarice at a Sunday service at my local church, and Talitha was sharing about the work that Clarice did in the community, and the way that Clarice opened my eyes and my heart to see the needs of the community around me was something that really just changed my posture, I think, towards the city first and foremost. One of the ways that we, as a family, my wife Nicole and I, wanted to reflect our love for the city and reflect that heart posture of engaging and caring for those in need was to be certified as foster parents. And around the same time that we were certified, we got a phone call from Talitha saying that there was a child who was born to a birth mother who had been served and cared for by Clarice, and this child needed a home. And then it just so happens, coincidentally, the next day we received a phone call from a social worker, a county social worker, that there was a child that needed a home. And we sort of asked some questions. Is this, we know about this child, we had some sort of knowledge about this child that was born, and some of the details are similar, and they said, no, it's not the same. And yet it turns out it's exactly the same child. So we said yes. And that child ended up being Bailey. Bailey was born in Santa Monica, and she was in the NICU, had some breathing issues and other things that were going on. The nurses there in Santa Monica, when we went to pick her up and meet her for the first time, were believers of all things, and they asked if they could pray for us. And so we were in the NICU praying for this little child. We didn't know what the future would hold, and yet we knew that she was there, Bailey was there, because of the work of Clarice. We knew that Bailey's birth mom had been cared for and served and loved by the work of Clarice. all in my heart, all I have for her is love and compassion. I'm grateful for her bravery. When we talk to Bailey about her birth mom, we tell her that her birth mom was brave. She was brave to bring Bailey into this world in a difficult situation. And so she is perfectly loved in God, and that is reflected in the love that people around her have shown her through Claris. We just play one role. We know that there's so many people involved just loving and serving. And I think that's what Claris does an amazing job of. It is an organization and people who just reach out in love, and then other people come alongside and reach out in love, and other people come alongside and reach out in love, and we work together to just care for people. And so I feel privileged to be able to be a part of that story and part of Bailey's story. Claris has been so significant for me and my family and our family, Nicole and I's family, because we would not have Bailey with us today if it wasn't for the work of Claris. And we are so grateful for everything that Talitha and the staff here at Claris did to serve Bailey's birth mom.
I think the thing that always struck me about this situation was that this was just one baby. And I do remember having this moment of like, pretty sure politically it was a very diverse room, right? And so if we talked about this situation outside of this baby and this mom, this might have looked very different. But for this moment, everyone was united that we want this baby's life saved. Little Bailey united all of these people and got them to put aside political beliefs or even differences to say, we just want you to be okay. If I could talk to Bailey's birth mom again, I would just tell her that it's okay. I think in that moment, I think it was really hard to say it's okay to make this choice because I wanted to fix the situation. Like, I really wanted her to choose what I thought would be the best choice. But now, having years to look back, I'm like, I think she did choose what was best for her in that moment, and I would want her to know that everything's okay. Like, your daughter's doing so good, and what you did was an act of love for her, you know, and that she would know that she's loved still, and that it's never too late. The futures in some of these stories are still being written, but hopefully you too can see the hand of God throughout it. Excruciating pain is often bathed in exploding love. And at some point, we can look back at our own desert experience and we can say, God, I don't understand why, but I trust you. It's the layoff that provided a better position, or the infertility that led to adoption, the mental health crisis that gave newfound empathy, or a divorce that turned into humility, or an addiction that brought deep community. You can fill in the blanks of your own life. See, we can trust that in the darkest moments, God is with us and he is working all things together for good. So I started off this morning by telling you about a man named Davy Blackburn and how he questioned God's kindness after his wife's murder. Well, Davy's story didn't end there. From that tragedy came a beautiful story of redemption and healing, of forgiveness and hope. I encourage you after the service at some point, check out his ministry, and he just wrote a book called Nothing is Wasted. And Davy says that what the enemy meant to serve as roadblocks, God has shifted into opportunity. Opportunity to serve, to love, to learn, to grow, and to impact others for eternity. See, that is the promise of God for you and for me. Thank you all. God bless you.